Well, Peter M. Beck spends much of his time moving between the US and Korea, teaching at both the American University in Washington and the Yonsei University in Seoul. He's a leading expert on North Korea. He joins us now in our Washington studio. Thanks for being there.
Thank you, Tony.
If the recent aggression amounts to North Korean brinkmanship, what do you think it would take to push us over the brink into war?
Well, this is a very serious development. It's the first time since the Korean War that we've had the North launching artillery and the South returning fire on civilian targets. So this does take us one step closer to the brink of war. You know, so far cooler heads have prevailed, but I'm very worried that the next time that this happens, it could be more serious, and if we're not careful, this could spiral into war.
We have seen a few incidents over the years, and very recently, for example, the sinking of a South Korean warship was, 45
Right.
sailors were killed in that event. So I'm wondering, is that worse, or is this one worse?
Well, I think this is worse. With the Cheonan sinking, when it happened, I wasn't sure that the North Koreans had done it. And even now that we have the final investigation report, it's still, we didn't really quite end up with the smoking gun. There are still lingering suspicions or questions that haven't been answered about that attack. There's still some mystery surrounding it, whereas this is just a very blatant attack on South Korea.
So how would you rank this among the various military provocations and crises that there have been since the end of the Korean War?
Of course, it's very subjective, but this is very close to the top. I expected another clash in the West Sea, in the Yellow Sea, but I did not expect them to start shelling an island populated with over 1,000 civilians.
Well, we are now going to see, we've got, in fact, a US carrier group steaming into the Yellow Sea at the moment to conduct war games with the South Koreans. The North Korean military say there'll be more attacks if there's further South Korean provocation. So one wonders if they're going to read these war games as provocation, and if there is going to be a tit-for-tat attacks continuing.
Well, the war games have been a fact of life on the Korean peninsula since the end of the Korean War. So, I think the North Koreans can look for and find almost any pretext they want for taking bellicose actions. But again, these actions are nothing new.
The interesting thing is the South Koreans are now beginning to talk about taking a much harder approach. In fact, talking about new rules of engagement. Do you have any idea what those new rules of engagement will be?
No, actually I don't, but they really have to take a harder line. I'm as peace-loving as anyone, but I was quite shocked and outraged by this incident, and I think I think the South Korean government even has to consider a retaliatory strike, whether it be on the North Korean Navy or on their nuclear facilities, because this is simply unacceptable, and so the South Korean government is facing some very agonizing decisions right now.
Yeah, the BBC's reporting the South Korean government thinks they've been far too soft, as you seem to be suggesting, that the current rules of engagement actually place too much emphasis on avoiding military conflict. But if you go the other way, doesn't conflict become inevitable?
Well, yes and no. North Korea has now taken 2 sucker punches on South Korea, and no one likes to be sucker punched once, let alone twice. And so I'm agonizing with this myself, but I'm coming around to the view that if North Korea is going to behave in such an outrageous and provocative manner, then they have to be shown that there are consequences. So far, China has not been willing to get tough with North Korea, and I'm not holding my breath that they will anytime soon. If that's the case, then the only message that may get through to the leadership is if they suffer serious losses of their own.
What do you make of the resignation this evening of South Korea's defense minister?
Well, I think they've handled this particular incident as well as they could, but when you couple it with the previous sinking of their ship, which really was an embarrassment to the South Korean Navy, I think it was sort of accumulation. But, South Korea is one of those countries where something goes wrong, blame a minister, and they resign.
It's very puzzling for outsiders to work out what is actually going on at the top of North Korean politics, and people tend to look for signs that indicate what's going on. The latest sign is a photograph that was taken of the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-il with his son and potential heir and one of the top military aides in the area where the military were doing the shelling very recently. So it's just been released, and it's an indication, evidently, that the order for the shelling came from the top levels.
Well, I had no doubt even before the release of the picture that it did, and you know, like everyone else, I scratched my head trying to figure out what is going through their heads. And the best that I can come up with is that this is a way for the new leaders that, you know, Kim Jong-il selected his son, his sister, and his sister's husband, as long as the general that you just mentioned, Ri Yong-ho, which I call the Gang of Four, to be his successor should he die in the near future. And I think this is a way for him to allow them to demonstrate their leadership abilities by taking these sucker punches on South Korea.
Why would he have chosen a group, as you call it, a gang of four, and not simply handed over to his son as his father handed over power to him?
Well, for two reasons. One, the son is 27 years old, and if anyone who looks at a picture, I mean, he still has his baby fat in some ways, or at least he's eating very well. He's too young, certainly by Korean standards. And also, Kim Jong-il knows that he may not have very long to live. I mean, we play this game of what's organ of the month is what I call it, of which organ happens to be failing him. So it's very hard to know how much longer. I'm sure he doesn't even know how much longer he has to live. Were he to die sooner rather than later, I think he knows that a 27-year-old will not be in a good position to take over. So I think his sister and his brother-in-law and his general are sort of an insurance policy to make sure that the transition goes smoothly.
What do we know about we know about the son, Kim Jong-un? He actually was educated partly, at least, in Switzerland. The uncle, the guy who married the dictator's sister, he was also has worked a lot abroad. I mean, do we know much about them? Is that likely to make them less of the hardline thinkers that the dictator is?
Well, there are signals that point in both directions. You know, North Korea is so often this Rorschach test, that sort of you see what you want to see. And if you look at Kim Jong-un, having spent his formative years in Switzerland, peace-loving Switzerland, we know that he likes Western culture. All three of Kim Jong-il's children like Western culture and even South Korean music and American films. So that would point to someone who's more urbane, more worldly than the current leadership in North Korea. Jang Sung-taek, as you mentioned, he's accompanied Kim Jong-il on almost all of his trips to China. He's even been to South Korea, and I have South Korean friends who have met with him, told me they thought he was a person that they could deal with, that he was a technocrat, a reformer. Others say he's a hardliner, and unfortunately, after this week's attack, I have to see the worst.
Well, of course, one thing we know about cliques that hold on to power in these kind of regimes is that they have an awful lot to lose, so they tend to keep the structures in place no matter if they change the leader.
They do, and again, you know, these are new leaders that are not only not known to us, but they're not known to the North Korean people, and this is a way of showing a million-man military and the North Korean public that they are capable leaders. And
one thing you've pointed out, I've read, is that Kim Jong-il has learnt over many years that he can actually get away with these military provocations. Do you think that's what's happening now? He's trying to establish a sort of place for his son in the pantheon of great military leaders, so he's doing the worst provocations since the Korean War.
Well, I think that's true. You know, you could argue that the last time we had a real wave of provocations by North Korea was in the early and mid-1980s. There was a Rangoon bombing in 1983 when they bombed the South Korean cabinet, led to severing of ties with Burma for more than 20 years. And then in 87, they took down a South Korean airliner. And this was the time when Kim Jong-il was consolidating his own position within. He'd only been introduced to the North Korean public in 1980. And spent the 1980s consolidating his own position within the North Korean government. So we have that as an example. And as you mentioned, the North so far hasn't paid any price for their attacks. The Cheonan did not lead to any decline in trade between North and South, even with North and South Korea. And China even increased their trade with North Korea. So that's another agonizing decision. I predicted after the sinking of the Cheonan that the government would not close down the Kaesong Special Industrial Complex, where there are 40,000 North Koreans working for over 100 South Korean companies. But now they're going to face a really tough question. Can they continue to operate as business as usual with North Korea when they're committing these serial acts of aggression?
In the meantime, we await any sort of strong move from China. There's been none, but apparently the US is at least attempting to send a signal to China by stationing this carrier group in the Yellow Sea, also, as it happens, off the coast of China. Do you think the Chinese will get this message and act upon it, or will they respond aggressively themselves? Because there were huge protests in China the last time there were going to be these kind of naval war games in the China Sea.
That's right. And, the last time that we think China started to put its foot down was when North Korea tested a nuke in 2006. They sent envoys to Pyongyang almost immediately, and it was not long after that negotiations began. But that also entailed Washington taking, the Bush administration no less, taking a more active stance towards negotiations and allowing bilateral talks to take place. So this could provoke the Chinese to finally put their foot down and say, look, cool it, we don't like having an American aircraft carrier right off our shore. And you're quite right, they were making threats last time. So this could be enough to trigger China's getting tough with North Korea. But I also think Washington needs to take a more proactive stance towards trying to engage the North Koreans.
It also, it's very hard to judge what's going on in China as well, but they did seem genuinely surprised by these attacks. And so one wonders whether they really do anymore have power over the regime in North Korea.
Well, they do have the power of the purse. The vast majority of North Korea's trade and investment is coming from China. Many think that if China cut off North Korea, that the regime would collapse. I don't think, in my view, I don't think North Korea would collapse, but life would get very, very difficult. About 2/3 of all consumer goods are coming from China. Fuel oil, key inputs for the North Korean economy. So China could make life very, very difficult for North Korea if they wanted to. However, that would lead to Chinese fears that the North could collapse. So they're reluctant to take that step. But I've urged Chinese leaders over the years to if they want to get a message across, do a temporary cutoff of aid and assistance, and they could get North Korea's attention without bringing down the regime if they so choose to do so.
It's a simple equation for the Chinese, isn't it? It's a strategic one. If the North Korean regime collapses, it becomes one Korea, and that's an ally of the United States, a military ally on their border. So it's hard to imagine them stepping back from that at the same time.
No, and they also, they're also concerned about refugees flowing into to China. There could be hundreds of thousands of North Koreans should the North implode. And you're right, they do not want American troops on the Yalu River. The last time we had American troops on the Yalu River, that led to China's entry into the Korean War. So that's something that they would like to avoid if at all possible.
A final quick question. China's called for an urgent resumption of the six-nation talks on North Korea's nuclear program. That seems pretty unlikely to happen, doesn't it?
Well, in the short term, they probably aren't going to hold talks. But really, it's the only mechanism we have for diffusing this type of crisis. Again, I think ultimately it will take nudging from China, but it'll also take more proactive stance by Washington. I was just on the plane with our envoy who just returned, Stephen Bosworth, who just returned from the region. But of course, he didn't talk to the North Koreans. He talked to everyone else. But it's going to be time in the not-too-distant future to actually talk to the North Koreans.
Peter and Beck, we'll have to leave you there. We thank you very much for taking time on Thanksgiving to come and join us on Late Line.
Thank you very much.